The Ashford ballroom glittered with the light of 1,000 candles on the evening of May 17th, 1817, their flames reflected in the enormous gilt mirrors that lined the cream and gold walls, turning the vast space into a shimmering jewel box of London society at the height of the season. Eleanor Whitmore stood beside the refreshment table, her gloved hands folded carefully at her waist, her posture correct and her expression serene, despite the familiar weight of invisibility that pressed upon her shoulders like a shawl she had worn too long. At 24, she had become accustomed to this position at the margins of such gatherings, neither hostess nor belle, neither chaperone nor debutante, occupying that uncomfortable territory reserved for women who had failed to secure a match during their seasons and now existed as living reminders of what happened when beauty and fortune aligned too modestly. The music swelled as dancers swept past in a blur of silk and satin, their laughter bright and careless, and Eleanor allowed herself a moment of quiet observation, finding a certain dignity in her role as witness rather than participant. She had long since made peace with the fact that her mousy brown hair and unremarkable features would never inspire poetry, that her dowry of £3,000 would never tempt a titled gentleman, that her greatest assets of intelligence and steady temperament were precisely the qualities society valued least in decorating its ballrooms. She watched Lady Catherine Ashford hold court near the orchestra, resplendent in emerald silk that matched her calculating eyes, surrounded by admirers who competed for her attention and favour. There had been a time when Eleanor felt the sting of such scenes acutely, when each ball brought fresh hope that might wither by evening's end. But time had taught her to expect nothing, and thus avoid the sharper edges of disappointment. It was therefore with genuine surprise that she noticed Captain James Langley detaching himself from a group of officers and approaching her directly, his scarlet regimentals immaculate, his handsome face arranged in an expression of pleasant interest that seemed entirely too focused for a man of his social standing addressing a woman of hers. "Miss Whitmore," he said, bowing with a flourish that drew several curious glances from nearby matrons. "I do hope you will forgive my forwardness, but I find the crowd rather oppressive this evening and wondered if you might be feeling similarly." Eleanor felt confusion ripple through her carefully maintained composure, uncertain how to interpret this sudden attention from a man who had never previously acknowledged her existence across 2 seasons of overlapping social engagements. She murmured something polite and non-committal, her mind working to understand what prompted this approach, what angle she could not yet perceive. Across the ballroom, she caught a glimpse of Lady Catherine watching them with an expression that might have been satisfaction had Eleanor been looking more closely, had she understood then what she would come to know too late. Eleanor had learned the architecture of disappointment through 6 long seasons of dwindling expectations, each year settling more firmly into the understanding that marriage was not to be her fate, that she would become one of those women who quietly faded into the role of maiden aunt, useful for minding children and managing households, but never the centre of her own story. Her mother Margaret reminded her with increasing desperation that the modest inheritance from her grandmother would not last forever, that £3,000 was respectable but hardly sufficient to secure independence, that without a husband Eleanor's future meant dependence on the charity of relatives or the grim prospect of becoming a governess, trading one form of invisibility for another even less comfortable. Her younger sister Sophia, just 19, and blessed with the fair prettiness that had somehow skipped Eleanor entirely, watched with troubled eyes as each season passed without success, her own debut delayed by their mother's insistence that the elder daughter must marry first, though everyone understood this was a formality that would soon be abandoned in favor of securing at least one advantageous match for the family. Eleanor felt the weight of being an obstacle to her sister's happiness, as acutely as she felt her own failure. Another layer of shame added to the thick sediment that had accumulated over years of being overlooked, passed by, deemed insufficient by the exacting calculus of the marriage mart that valued beauty and fortune above all else, and found her lacking in both. Captain Langley's continued attention throughout the evening felt increasingly wrong, his compliments too effusive, his proximity too familiar, his suggestions that they escape the oppressive heat of the ballroom for the cooler air of the conservatory, delivered with an insistence that made Eleanor's carefully honed instincts whisper warnings she could not quite articulate. She demurred twice, mentioning propriety and the impropriety of being alone with a gentleman, but he laughed away her concerns with assurances that the conservatory was visible from the terrace, that dozens of guests were taking air there, that surely a woman of her maturity need not worry about chaperonage like some nervous debutante. The subtle insult embedded in that last observation, the reminder of her age and unmarried status, worked its intended effect, making her reluctance seem foolish and provincial, the overcaution of a woman who had no reason to guard a reputation that held no particular value. She felt herself agreeing even as unease prickled along her spine, felt herself following him through the French doors onto the terrace and down the stone steps toward the glass palace of the conservatory that glowed with lamplight against the dark gardens, felt the warm May evening wrap around her like a suffocating embrace, and understood too late that she was walking into something she could not yet name, but already feared. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The conservatory wrapped around Eleanor like a humid embrace the moment they stepped through its glass doors, the air thick with the perfume of night-blooming jasmine, and the earthy richness of damp soil, exotic ferns cascading from brass planters while orange trees stretched toward the glass ceiling where moonlight filtered through in silver geometric patterns that dappled the tiled floor with shifting shadows subtils. She had thought to find other guests seeking cooler air as Captain Langley had promised, but the space was empty, save for the plants that pressed close on either side of the narrow gravel path, creating an unsettling intimacy she had not anticipated, and that made her instincts flare with renewed warning, even as she told herself she was being foolish, that surely nothing untoward could happen in a conservatory, attached to a ballroom full of guests just steps away. Captain Langley gestured toward a stone bench near a towering palm, suggesting they rest a moment, but before Eleanor could respond or retreat, his entire demeanor shifted with a suddenness that stole her breath, the pleasant expression sliding from his face to reveal something calculating and cold beneath, as his hand shot out to capture hers with a grip that was too tight, too insistent, pulling her toward him with a force that made her stumble against his chest. "Miss Whitmore, surely you understand what your encouragement has led to," he said, his voice loud enough to carry beyond the glass walls, his free hand moving to her waist with a familiarity that made her skin crawl with revulsion and shock. She pulled back with all her strength, her voice finding itself in a sharp protest that he was mistaken, that she had encouraged nothing, that he must release her immediately. But he only tightened his grip and pulled her closer still, his face descending toward hers in a grotesque parody of passion that made her understanding crystallize with sickening clarity that this was performance, that she was not the audience, but the prop in a theater piece written without her knowledge or consent. Before she could scream or strike or escape his hold, the conservatory doors burst open with such force that they banged against the glass walls and light flooded the space as Lady Catherine Ashford swept in, followed by her mother, the Dowager Countess, and a stream of guests who carried lamps that blazed with sudden illuminating cruelty, turning the intimate darkness into a stage where Eleanor stood. In Captain Langley's arms, in a tableau that could only be read one way by society's merciless judgment. "Eleanor Whitmore," Lady Catherine's voice rang with triumphant shock, perfectly calibrated for maximum effect. "What is the meaning of this disgraceful display?" And Eleanor understood with the force of physical blow that she had been trapped, that every moment of this evening had been orchestrated toward this precise instant, that her ruin had been designed with malicious precision, and she had walked into it with the helpless inevitability of Greek tragedy. The collective gasp that rose from the assembled witnesses hit Eleanor like a physical wave, followed immediately by the whispered hissing that always accompanied scandal, that serpentine sound of reputations being devoured in real time, and she stood frozen in Captain Langley's grip for one endless moment before he released her with such sudden force that she stumbled backward into the sharp leaves of a potted palm, the pain barely registering against the greater agony of understanding what had just been done to her and what it meant for every aspect of her future. Captain Langley stepped back with his hands raised in a gesture of shocked innocence that would have been laughable if Eleanor had possessed any capacity for laughter in that moment, his face arranging itself into an expression of bewildered dismay as he stammered apologies and protestations that he had misunderstood, that Miss Whitmore had seemed to encourage, that surely she had indicated, his words trailing into calculated confusion that laid the blame squarely on her shoulders, while maintaining his own veneer of gentlemanly honor compromised by feminine deception. Lady Catherine advanced into the conservatory with the light of triumph blazing in her eyes, her voice cutting through the whispers with pronouncements about shocking behavior and disgraceful displays, about what respectable families must endure from social climbers who would use any means to entrap officers of good family. And Eleanor heard the story being written in real time, the narrative that would define her in society's memory being composed with vicious efficiency by a woman whose hatred she had not even known she had earned until this moment revealed it in all its calculated cruelty. The other guests pressed forward with the eager hunger of those who had stumbled upon entertainment far more thrilling than any ballroom diversion could provide, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock and delight and judgment, the young ladies gasping behind gloved hands while their mothers looked on with stern disapproval that barely concealed their satisfaction at seeing another woman ruined, their own daughters elevated by comparison, the gentlemen observing with knowing smirks that suggested Eleanor had simply been caught at a game all women played and lost through insufficient cunning. Through the crowd that pressed ever closer, drawn by scandal like moths to flame, Eleanor saw a figure standing apart near the conservatory entrance, a tall man with dark hair silvered at the temples who made no move to join the crushing throng, but simply observed the scene with an expression Eleanor could not read across the distance and through her tears. And she realized with a jolt of recognition that cut through even her overwhelming mortification that it was Duke Alexander Thornhill, perhaps the most eligible and certainly the most discerning man in London society, a man who had spoken to her exactly 3 times in 2 seasons at various events where their paths had crossed, brief exchanges about books and weather that she had treasured far beyond their significance, because he had looked at her as though she existed, as though her words merited attention. His grey eyes met hers across the space of ruined glass and crushed flowers and malicious witnesses, and in that moment Eleanor saw something in his expression that looked almost like understanding or perhaps pity, and the weight of being seen in her absolute degradation by the one man whose regard she had quietly hoped for without ever admitting such hope even to herself, proved to be the final, unbearable addition to her burden of shame. She turned and fled through the crowd that parted before her like water around a stone, ran from the conservatory and through the gardens without thought for her shawl or reticule or anything but escape, her slippers sliding on gravel paths as she made her way toward the street where she prayed their carriage waited, the sound of laughter and shocked exclamations following her into the night like hunting hounds on the trail of wounded prey. The carriage ride home passed in a blur of street lamps and shadows, Eleanor huddled in the corner with her arms wrapped around herself while her mother sat across from her in terrible silence. That was somehow worse than screaming would have been, the air thick with accusation and disbelief and something approaching grief for a daughter's future that had been obliterated in the space of 10 minutes in a conservatory that smelled of jasmine and betrayal. When they arrived at the modest Whitmore townhouse on Cavendish Square, Eleanor stumbled from the carriage and up the steps without waiting for assistance, her only thought to reach the sanctuary of her room before the full weight of what had happened could crush her entirely. But her father emerged from his Sars study as she crossed the entrance hall, his face grey and aged by 10 years in the span of a single evening, his eyes meeting hers with a question he could not voice, and she could not answer except to shake her head in mute denial that meant nothing against the evidence of a dozen witnesses who had seen her in Captain Langley's arms. Her mother began to weep then, great heaving sobs that echoed through the house and brought the servants creeping to doorways to witness the family's disgrace, and Eleanor felt herself fragmenting under the accumulated weight of her mother's tears and her father's silence, and the knowledge that by morning all of London would know her name and her shame. Sophia appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightdress, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, only 19 and still innocent of the casual cruelty society could inflict, and she came down to Eleanor without hesitation despite their mother's protests, wrapping her arms around her elder sister and guiding her up the stairs to Eleanor's room, where she helped her out of the beautiful bronze silk gown that would forever be associated with this disaster, unpinning her hair and bringing water to wash away the tears and the remaining traces of careful grooming that had been meant to help Eleanor make the most of her modest charms, but had instead made her a better trophy for Lady Catherine's revenge. Through the long hours of that night, Sophia sat beside Eleanor's bed and held her hand while Eleanor stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how she had become the instrument of someone else's malice, how her very invisibility had made her useful for purposes she had never imagined. And slowly, the pieces assembled themselves into a picture she should have seen earlier if she had believed herself important enough to be worth using. She remembered now the whispers 2 months earlier about Captain Langley's attentions to Lady Catherine's niece, the pretty Isabella Ashford, who was meant to make a brilliant match, remembered how those attentions had ceased abruptly, and how Isabella had been seen looking pale and unhappy at subsequent events, and Eleanor understood with sickening clarity that she had been selected specifically because of her insignificance, because ruining her would punish the captain for his defection while costing Lady Catherine nothing of social consequence, because Eleanor Whitmore at 24, with her modest dowry and unremarkable face, was expendable in the calculations of those who moved in higher circles. Dawn came with grey light that offered no comfort and no solutions, only the certainty that her life as she had known it was finished, that no respectable family would receive her, that her younger sister's prospects would be damaged by association, that her parents would bear the shame of a daughter ruined before she could even be married. And Eleanor lay in her bed and felt the full measure of her powerlessness in a world that would not hear her truth against the evidence of appearances. The morning brought callers to the Whitmore townhouse on Cavendish Square, but they came not with sympathy or support, but with the gleeful hunger of those who had smelled blood in the water and circled now to witness the final thrashing of their prey, ladies who had never deigned to acknowledge Eleanor at social events, now arriving with their daughters in tow to deliver pointed comments disguised as concern while their eyes catalogued every detail of the family's distress for later retelling in drawing rooms across Mayfair. Eleanor remained in her room with the curtains drawn against the pale spring sunlight that seemed an affront to her misery, listening to the sounds of the house below where her mother received the parade of false friends with increasingly frantic justifications that convinced no one and only deepened the household's humiliation, her voice rising and breaking as she insisted that her Eleanor was a good girl, that there must have been some misunderstanding, that Captain Langley had surely taken advantage. But Eleanor could hear in the brief silences that followed each protestation the disbelief and dismissal of women who had already decided the story and found Margaret Whitmore's denials pathetic rather than persuasive. Sophia brought her tea that Eleanor could not drink, and toast that turned to ash in her mouth, sitting beside her in wordless solidarity. That was the only comfort available in a situation that admitted no real comfort. And together, they listened to the carriage wheels on the street outside that signaled the arrival and departure of each new witness to their family's disgrace. The afternoon dragged toward evening with Eleanor caught in a peculiar suspended state between the certainty of her ruin and the inability to fully comprehend what form that ruin would take, whether her family would send her to live with relatives in the country, where her presence would not damage Sophia's prospects, whether they would simply keep her hidden away in this house like a shameful secret, whether there was any possible future beyond the four walls of her bedroom and the endless repetition of that moment in the conservatory when the doors had burst open and her life had shattered like the glass panes overhead. Then, at nearly 5 in the afternoon, when the stream of callers had finally ceased and the house had fallen into exhausted quiet, the brass knocker sounded again with an authoritative rhythm that was different from the eager rapping of gossip-mongers, and Eleanor heard the butler's measured tread across the entrance hall, followed by a long pause, and then hushed, urgent voices that carried a different quality of surprise. Sophia went to investigate, and returned moments later with her face pale and her eyes wide with confusion, reporting that Duke Alexander Thornhill's private secretary stood in the entrance hall requesting a private audience with their father on a matter of utmost importance and discretion, and the household had been thrown into utter bewilderment, because what could the Duke of Thornhill possibly want with Thomas Whitmore, and why would he send his secretary the very day after the scandal that had destroyed the Whitmore family's standing in society? Eleanor heard her father's heavy tread upon the stairs, and then his knock upon her door, softer than usual, almost apologetic. And when she opened it, his face bore an expression she could not read. Bewilderment mixed with something that might have been hope, but seemed too fragile to name in a house where hope had been extinguished so thoroughly the night before. He asked her to come down to his study, said there was a matter that required her presence, would not meet her eyes when she asked what matter could possibly require her input now that her ruin was complete, and Sophia helped her into a simple day dress of pale grey that seemed appropriate for a girl in disgrace, while Eleanor's hands shook so badly her sister had to fasten the buttons. The walk down the stairs felt like a descent to judgment, each step heavy with dread. And when her father opened the study door, Eleanor saw Duke Alexander Thornhill standing beside the window with his hands clasped behind his back, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon light, and the shock of his presence in her father's modest study was so profound she stopped in the doorway until her father's gentle hand at her elbow guided her inside. The Duke turned, and his eyes met hers with that same unreadable expression he had worn the previous night when he had appeared through the crowd of witnesses to her shame, and he bowed with perfect formality before addressing her father in a voice that was calm and measured, and utterly at odds with the chaos that had consumed Eleanor's world. He stated that he had been present at the Ashford ball, that he had observed the events of the previous evening with great attention, that his observations had led him to certain conclusions about the nature of what had transpired in the conservatory, and Eleanor felt her face burn with humiliation that this man, this Duke whose brief conversations with her at 3 different events over 2 seasons had been among the few moments she had felt truly seen in society. should now be recounting the details of her disgrace in her father's study. But his next words stopped her breath entirely, for he stated with absolute certainty that Miss Eleanor Whitmore had been an unwilling participant in an orchestrated trap, that he had watched Captain Langley maneuver her away from the ballroom with obvious intent, that he had followed at a discreet distance and witnessed through the conservatory windows the captain's unprovoked advances and Eleanor's clear resistance, that he had seen Lady Catherine and her party positioned and waiting for their cue to enter, and that he was prepared to state publicly that Miss Whitmore was entirely blameless in an affair designed to ruin her for purposes that had nothing to do with her own actions. The silence that followed this declaration was absolute. Her father frozen in his chair, and Eleanor standing with her hand pressed to her throat as tears began to slide down her face. Not tears of shame now, but of something approaching relief that someone had witnessed the truth, that her protests were not merely the desperate claims of a ruined girl, but were confirmed by a witness whose word society could not dismiss. Then the Duke spoke again, and the world tilted on. Its axis, for he stated with the same calm formality that he wished to propose a solution that would restore Miss Whitmore's reputation and prevent any lasting damage to her family's standing, and the solution he proposed was marriage, his marriage to Eleanor, to take place within the week before the scandal could metastasize beyond repair. Eleanor heard the words, but could not make them signify, her mind refusing to arrange them into coherent meaning, because surely the Duke of Thornhill had not just proposed marriage to her in her father's study, while she stood in a grey dress that marked her disgrace, with her face still wet from tears, and her reputation shattered beyond any repair that did not involve exile or permanent spinsterhood in some remote country village where no one knew the scandal that had consumed her life. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged, and her father was speaking now with a tremor in his voice that revealed how close he had come to despair before this impossible salvation had appeared at their door, asking the Duke if he was certain, if he understood the magnitude of what he offered. And Alexander Thornhill turned his steady gaze from Eleanor to her father and said with quiet conviction that he had never been more certain of anything in his life. Eleanor found her voice then, though it came out barely above a whisper, as she asked the question that burned through her confusion. Why would a duke rescue her when he could have any woman in England, women of beauty and fortune and spotless reputation, who would bring him alliance and children without the taint of scandal? And his eyes returned to hers with an intensity that made her breath catch as he explained in that same measured tone that he had observed her for 2 seasons at various assemblies and dinners where they had exchanged brief words about literature and music and the hypocrisy of social conventions, that he had noted her dignity in the face of society's dismissal, her intelligence that she did not hide behind false simpering, her genuine kindness to those beneath her in station, and he had thought even then that Miss Eleanor Whitmore possessed qualities that the celebrated beauties of the ton lacked entirely. He stated that society's judgment of her was not only unjust, but revealed the moral bankruptcy of a system that valued performance over character, appearance over substance, and that he wanted a wife who would be a true partner in life, rather than a decorative object to be displayed at balls and forgotten in the intervals between social seasons. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she had built over years of being overlooked and dismissed, and she wanted desperately to believe him, but disbelief warred with hope, because how could this be real? How could the worst night of her life transform into this impossible offer from a man she had admired from a distance, but never imagined might see her as anything more than a moderately intelligent wallflower worthy of brief, kind conversation? Her father was accepting before she could fully process her own reaction, his relief and gratitude pouring forth in words that mixed thanks with apology for the modest dowry he could offer, But the Duke raised a hand and said the dowry was immaterial, that his condition for this marriage was not financial, but practical, that Captain James Langley must accept a military posting to India and depart London within the fortnight. And Eleanor understood with sudden clarity that the Duke intended not only to rescue her, but to punish the man who had been instrument to her ruin. Alexander turned to her then and asked with a gentleness that nearly undid her composure entirely whether she could consent to become his wife, whether she could accept this solution to circumstances neither of them had chosen, and Eleanor heard herself say yes, though her voice shook, and tears began again, because what else could she say when the alternative was ruin, and what she felt was not reluctant gratitude, but something closer to wonder that this man had truly seen her all along. The week that followed moved with a velocity that left Eleanor breathless and unmoored, her days consumed with preparations for a wedding she could scarcely believe was her own, while her nights were haunted by a confusion of fear and gratitude that knotted together until she could not separate one from the other. She barely knew the Duke, had exchanged perhaps a dozen brief conversations with him across 2 seasons, at events where his attention had felt like unexpected sunlight breaking through clouds, but had never suggested anything beyond polite regard for a moderately intelligent woman who read the same poets he admired. And now she was to become his wife in 7 days, to stand beside him and speak vows that would bind her life to his in ways she could not yet comprehend. Sophia was her constant companion through those bewildering days, helping her sort through the sudden influx of dressmakers and milliners who appeared as if summoned by the Duke's resources. And though her sister's excitement was genuine, it was tempered by concern that showed in the way she studied Eleanor's face when she thought herself unobserved, searching perhaps for signs of hysteria or collapse that never quite came because Eleanor found herself suspended in a strange calm that felt less like peace than shock. Her mother had transformed from weeping despair to manic joy in the space of a single afternoon, her relief at Eleanor's salvation from ruin so profound that she could speak of nothing but the wedding and the unimaginable elevation of their family. And Eleanor found she could not bear to be in the same room with her mother's gratitude, because it made her feel like an object that had been rescued from the rubbish heap, rather than a woman about to embark on marriage. On the 3rd day, a package arrived from the Duke, delivered by his secretary with formal courtesy, and when Eleanor opened it in the privacy of her small bedroom, she found 3 books, their leather bindings rich and supple beneath her fingers, and she recognized them as volumes they had discussed briefly at Lady Pemberton's musical 8 months prior, works of poetry she had mentioned admiring, but had never been able to afford on her modest allowance. Tucked inside the first volume was a note in a bold, angular hand that she now knew belonged to Alexander, and it said simply that he hoped these might provide some comfort during a difficult week, and that he looked forward to many future conversations about the ideas contained within them, that he had every hope their marriage might be built on a foundation of mutual respect and intellectual companionship, even if the circumstances of its beginning were less than ideal. Eleanor read the note 4 times, her fingers tracing the words as if she might decode some deeper meaning hidden in the ink, and she felt something shift inside her chest, some small easing of the terror that had gripped her since the morning in her father's study, when she had said yes to a man who remained largely a mystery. She began to wonder then who Alexander Thornhill truly was beneath the title and the formal courtesy. What manner of man thought to send books to a frightened bride rather than jewels or flowers? And the wondering felt like the first tentative step toward something that might eventually become understanding, if not yet trust. The wedding day arrived with morning light that filtered through Eleanor's bedroom window, in pale gold streams that seemed to mock the solemnity of the occasion, because this was not the joyful celebration most brides anticipated, but rather a rescue wrapped in ceremony. And she stood before the mirror while Sophia fastened the tiny pearl buttons along the back of her gown, a dress of ivory silk that the Duke had commissioned from London's finest modiste, though Eleanor had not been measured for it, and yet it fit as if made for her body alone, clinging to her modest figure before falling in elegant lines to the floor where Brussels lace pooled like sea foam. Her hair had been arranged simply because there was no time for elaborate preparations, and because Eleanor could not bear the fuss, dark brown strands twisted and pinned with a few small flowers that Sophia had gathered from their modest garden that morning. And when Eleanor looked at her reflection, she saw not a radiant bride, but a woman still half in shock, her face pale and her eyes too large and shadowed with sleeplessness and confusion. The chapel was small and dim when they arrived, only immediate family present, as the Duke had insisted, because a grand wedding would have been spectacle rather than salvation. And Eleanor walked down the short aisle on her father's arm, feeling as though she moved through water or dream, everything slightly unreal and muffled. Alexander stood waiting near the altar in dark blue superfine that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the austere handsomeness of his features, and when Eleanor reached him and her father placed her hand in his, she felt the warmth and steadiness of his grip, and heard him murmur so quietly that only she could hear that she need not be afraid, that he would not fail her. The ceremony proceeded with words that Eleanor had heard at other weddings, but which now carried weight that pressed against her chest like stones, the vicar's voice intoning the sacred vows that would bind her life to this man's until death parted them. And when it came time to speak, her own promises, Eleanor's voice emerged thin and trembling, while Alexander's remained steady and sure, as if he possessed no doubts whatsoever about the extraordinary step they were taking. She felt the cool slide of gold as he placed his ring upon her finger, a band etched with an intricate pattern of vines and leaves that must have belonged to his family for generations. And then the vicar pronounced them man and wife, and Alexander lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture that was both formal and somehow tender. The wedding breakfast that followed in her parents' cramped dining room was an awkward affair, conversation stilted and strange, because what did one say at a wedding born of scandal and rescue? But Alexander navigated it with a grace that suggested he felt no discomfort whatsoever. Speaking warmly to Sophia about her watercolors and thanking Eleanor's mother for welcoming him into their family, though everyone knew the gratitude flowed entirely in the other direction. Eleanor learned through whispered conversation that Captain Langley had already departed for India 3 days prior, his protests and objections crushed beneath the Duke's influence, and coldly delivered threats that suggested Alexander Thornhill was not a man who tolerated those who harmed what he had chosen to protect, and that Lady Catherine's fury had become the talk of every drawing-room in London, though her power to harm Eleanor had evaporated the moment Alexander placed his ring upon her finger. When the breakfast finally concluded, and Alexander handed Eleanor into his crested carriage for the journey to Derbyshire, she settled against the velvet cushions and thought with a bewilderment that bordered on hysteria that she was now a duchess, that the girl who had been invisible and overlooked for 24 years had been transformed in the space of 7 days into one of the highest-ranking women in England, and she did not know whether to laugh or weep at the impossible strangeness of it all. The journey to Derbyshire began in silence, Eleanor seated on one side of the luxurious carriage and Alexander on the other, the space between them feeling wider than the mere 3 feet of upholstered bench because it contained all her confusion and fear and the strangeness of being alone for the first time with the man who was now her husband. And she kept her gaze fixed on the passing landscape beyond the window where London's cramped streets gradually gave way to open countryside, though she scarcely registered what she saw, because her mind churned with questions she could not ask, and emotions she could not name. Alexander allowed the silence to stretch for perhaps 20 minutes, his own gaze seemingly occupied with documents he had withdrawn from a leather case. But then he set the papers aside with deliberate care and cleared his throat gently, and when Eleanor glanced at him with startled eyes, he smiled in a way that seemed meant to reassure rather than intimidate. He asked if she had begun the volumes of poetry he had sent, his voice carrying genuine interest rather than mere politeness, and Eleanor found herself answering more readily than she had expected, admitting that she had read several poems from the Byron collection and found them both beautiful and troubling in their intensity. This sparked a conversation that began cautiously, but gained momentum as they discovered their responses to literature aligned in unexpected ways, Alexander revealing that he had always found Byron's work fascinating, precisely because of its willingness to examine the darker corners of human feeling, and Eleanor venturing the opinion that perhaps darkness acknowledged was less dangerous than darkness denied, which made Alexander regard her with an expression of such approval that she felt warmth rise in her cheeks. The miles passed more easily then, their conversation ranging from poetry to philosophy to the question of whether the new agricultural methods being promoted by reformers would truly benefit tenant farmers or merely line the pockets of landowners. And Eleanor was astonished to discover that Alexander not only welcomed her opinions, but seemed to genuinely consider them, asking follow-up questions that suggested he valued intelligence over agreement. At one point during a discussion of estate management, he said quietly that he had watched her for longer than she knew, that over the course of 2 seasons he had observed her quiet strength and the way she maintained her dignity, even when society looked through her as if she were invisible, and that he had long thought the ton fools for failing to recognize genuine worth when it stood before them in modest muslin rather than elaborate silks. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief, her throat tight with emotion she could not express, because no one had ever suggested before that her invisibility was society's failure rather than her own inadequacy, and she felt something crack open inside her chest, some space for hope she had not known existed. Her disbelief began to give way then to cautious curiosity, a wondering about what manner of man this Duke truly was and what their life together might become. And when the carriage finally turned onto a long tree-lined drive and Alexander said softly that they were home, Eleanor looked ahead to see a great house of golden stone rising before them, all elegant proportions and mullioned windows that caught the afternoon light, and she understood with overwhelming force that this beautiful, impossible place was now hers, that she was mistress of an estate so grand she could never have dreamed of entering it except as an awed visitor, and the sheer scale of her transformation from overlooked wallflower to Duchess of Thornhill left her breathless and dizzy with wonder and terror mingled together, until she could not tell where one ended and the other began. The first days at Thornhill unfolded with a gentleness that Eleanor had not anticipated, beginning that very first evening when Alexander led her through the great house, and she braced herself for the moment when he would show her to his bedchamber, and the duties of marriage would commence. But instead he paused before a set of double doors and said quietly that these were her private apartments, that she should consider them her sanctuary, where she need never fear intrusion. And when he opened the doors, Eleanor found herself looking into rooms decorated in soft blues and creams, with windows that overlooked the rose gardens, and a sitting room fitted with comfortable chairs and shelves already waiting for the books she would collect. He explained with a care that suggested he had given the matter considerable thought that his own chambers were in the opposite wing, that he believed they both needed time to adjust to this sudden marriage, and that he would never press her for intimacies she was not ready to offer, which left Eleanor feeling a confusing mixture of relief and something else she could not quite name, as she thanked him in a voice gone small with emotion. The following morning Alexander appeared at breakfast and asked if she would like to see the library, and when Eleanor nodded, he guided her through corridors hung with portraits of stern ancestors to a magnificent room that stretched 40 feet in length, with walls lined floor to ceiling with more volumes than she had imagined existed in one private collection. Leather bindings in browns and greens and burgundies, the smell of old paper and leather and beeswax filling the air. And Alexander told her with evident pleasure that all of this was now hers to explore as she wished, that he hoped she would consider the library a shared space where they might spend quiet evenings together. Later that same day he took her through the gardens, where late spring flowers bloomed in profusion, tulips and early roses and beds of lavender beginning to show purple. And he mentioned almost diffidently that the gardens had been rather neglected since his mother's death 5 years prior, that if Eleanor had interest in redesigning them, she should consider the space entirely her domain, and he would ensure she had whatever resources and staff she required. Eleanor met the housekeeper, Mrs. Pembroke, that afternoon, a woman of perhaps 50, with kind eyes and capable hands, who showed no sign of judgment or curiosity about the scandalous circumstances of the marriage, but instead welcomed Eleanor warmly and made it clear that the household staff were prepared to serve their new duchess with loyalty and respect. The days settled into a pattern that allowed Eleanor to slowly relax the tight fear she had carried. Mornings spent exploring the house and grounds, afternoons often in the library, where Alexander would join her, and they would read in companionable silence or discuss what they had discovered in their books, and evenings at dinner, where conversation ranged widely, and Eleanor found herself speaking more freely than she ever had, because Alexander listened with genuine attention and asked questions that showed he valued her thoughts. She began to notice small things about him, the way he rubbed his temple when tired, how he smiled slightly when amused, even if he did not laugh, the consideration he showed to every servant, and during one dinner when he spoke quietly about the loneliness of his position since inheriting the title at 25, and the weight of responsibilities that left little room for authentic connection, Eleanor felt her heart contract with unexpected sympathy, and wondered if perhaps they were both lonely people who had found in this strange marriage an opportunity for something neither had dared hope for. The growing connection between them deepened through small moments that accumulated like coins in a purse until Eleanor found herself wealthy in a currency she had never possessed before, the currency of being truly seen and valued. And it began perhaps a week into their residence at Thornhill, when Alexander asked during breakfast if she might accompany him on his morning rounds of the estate, because he wished to hear her thoughts on a dispute between two tenant farmers over water rights, and Eleanor had stared at him in confusion, because no one had ever sought her opinion on matters of consequence. She went with him, though, riding in the small gig he drove himself rather than the formal carriage, and as they travelled the lanes between fields green with early summer growth, Alexander explained the situation with careful detail that suggested he believed her capable of understanding complexity, and when he asked what she thought, Eleanor found herself offering an observation about compromise and mutual benefit that made Alexander smile with such approval that she felt warmth spread through her chest like wine. After that he sought her counsel regularly on estate matters both large and small, asking her perspective on everything from the planned expansion of the village school to the question of whether the home farm should experiment with new crop rotation methods. And Eleanor discovered that he valued intelligence over convention and seemed to genuinely weigh her suggestions rather than merely humoring her. They fell into a pattern of long walks through the gardens in the late afternoons when Alexander's business was concluded, discussing not just practical matters, but ideas drawn from their reading, debating philosophy and politics and the nature of social obligation, and Eleanor felt herself unfurling like the roses that bloomed along the garden walls, petals opening to sunlight after years of remaining tightly closed against the cold wind of dismissal. She began to speak more freely, to offer opinions without the constant internal censoring that had marked her interaction with society. And she watched Alexander watching her with an expression that suggested he found her conversation not just tolerable, but genuinely engaging, which seemed impossible and yet proved itself true day after day. One afternoon, perhaps 3 weeks into their marriage, they were both in the library reaching for the same volume on the upper shelf, a treatise on agricultural reform Alexander had mentioned wanting to consult, and Eleanor had been curious to examine. And their hands met on the leather spine, and Eleanor felt a jolt of sensation, like touching metal after walking across thick carpet in winter, electric and startling. And she looked up to find Alexander gazing down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, because his carefully maintained restraint seemed suddenly fragile, and she could see in his grey eyes something that looked remarkably like longing. He stepped back after a moment that stretched longer than propriety should allow, clearing his throat and gesturing that she should take the book. But his regard remained clear, and Eleanor felt her guarded heart, which had learned through years of disappointment to expect nothing, begin to crack open just slightly, admitting the dangerous possibility that perhaps this marriage born of scandal and necessity might become something neither of them had dared imagine when they spoke those binding vows. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June, when the roses Eleanor had begun to tend were reaching their full glory, and she had started to believe that perhaps the worst was truly behind her, that the fragile happiness growing between her and Alexander might be allowed to flourish undisturbed. But the cream-coloured envelope with its London postmark and the handwriting she recognized as belonging to her mother's friend, Lady Sinclair, should have warned her that the poison of scandal had a long reach. Eleanor opened it in the morning room where sunlight streamed through tall windows and illuminated the careful script that began with false sympathy before delivering its Genjung purpose. The news that Lady Catherine Ashford had been holding court in London drawing rooms and spreading a particular version of events that painted the Duke as a quixotic fool who had married Eleanor out of misplaced chivalry and pity, that the marriage was understood by all discerning persons to be a sham arrangement where the Duke maintained his true interests elsewhere, while his unfortunate wife lived in isolated eggs at his country estate. And Lady Sinclair wrote that she felt Eleanor should know what was being said, though, of course, she herself gave no credit to such gossip. The words blurred before Eleanor's eyes as the familiar shame rose in her throat like bile, the old certainty that she was somehow fundamentally unworthy crashing back over the careful confidence she had been building. Because of course it made sense that Alexander had married her from duty and compassion rather than any Genjung regard, that his kindness was the behavior of a principled man toward an obligation rather than the attention of a husband toward a wife he had chosen, and she felt herself withdrawing into the small, cold space she had inhabited for so many years before Alexander had briefly coaxed her into warmth. She did not go down to luncheon, sending word that she had a headache, and she avoided the library that afternoon and took her walk alone rather than waiting for Alexander to join her as had become their custom. But he found her anyway in the rose garden as the sun slanted golden through the late afternoon, and asked with immediate concern what had happened to distress her, because he had noticed her absence and her withdrawal. Eleanor tried to dismiss it as nothing, unwilling to reveal the depth of her shame, but Alexander persisted with a gentle insistence, until finally she retrieved the letter from her pocket, where it had rested like a stone, and handed it to him without meeting his eyes, waiting for him to laugh or offer platitudes or, worst of all, to confirm through careful words that the gossip contained truth. Instead, she heard the rustle of paper and then a silence that stretched until she looked up to find his face transformed by an anger she had never seen, his grey eyes gone hard as winter ice and his jaw tight. And he said in a voice that shook slightly that he would like to know who had given Lady Catherine Ashford the right to speak of his marriage, or his wife, or his reasons for anything he chose to do. He stepped closer to Eleanor and took her hands in his, heedless of any servant who might observe, and told her with a fierce intensity that drove every word home like a nail that he had not married her from pity or duty, but because in 2 seasons of watching her navigate society's dismissal with quiet dignity. He had seen more Zhenzheng worth in her than in all the celebrated beauties who performed for attention, that he had married her because he wanted a wife who possessed intelligence and character, and the strength to remain kind in the face of cruelty, and that if she believed for one moment that he considered their marriage anything less than the greatest good fortune of his life, then he had failed utterly in showing her what she meant to him. Alexander's declaration in the rose garden changed something fundamental between them, but it also crystallized a resolve in him that became evident the following morning when he joined Eleanor for breakfast and announced with calm determination that they would return to London for the remainder of the season because she deserved to hold her head high as his Duchess, and he would not allow Lady Catherine's poison to go unanswered or permit society to believe for one moment that their marriage was anything other than what it truly was. Eleanor felt terror rise in her throat at the thought of facing the drawing rooms and ballrooms where she had been scorned, where the scandal had unfolded, where even now her name was surely being whispered with knowing looks and cruel laughter. But Alexander reached across the table and took her hand and told her that she would not face it alone, that she would enter every room on his arm with the full weight of his title and his regard making clear to anyone with eyes that he considered himself the fortunate party in their union. The preparations for London began immediately despite Eleanor's trembling reluctance, and Alexander proved himself not just her husband, but her ally and advocate, spending hours coaching her in the subtle arts of navigating society from a position of power rather than vulnerability, teaching her how a duchess could silence gossip with a raised eyebrow or a cool glance, how to wield his consequence as both shield and sword, how to move through rooms as though she owned them, because in many ways she now did. He was patient with her fears, but insisted gently that she possessed more strength than she credited herself with, and Eleanor found herself drawing on reserves of courage she had not known existed, bolstered by his unwavering confidence in her. She watched him during those days of preparation, observed how he spoke of her to his steward and his secretary and the staff with a pride that seemed entirely genuine, how he consulted her on every detail of their London household arrangements as though her preferences mattered deeply to him, how his eyes followed her when he thought she was not looking with an expression that made her heart race, and she realized with a feeling like falling that she was no longer merely grateful to this man or cautiously hopeful about their partnership, but was actually falling in love with her husband, truly and deeply in love in a way she had never expected to experience. The realization terrified her almost as much as the prospect of facing London society, because love made one vulnerable, and she feared that despite his passionate declaration, Alexander might still see her fundamentally as an obligation nobly undertaken, a woman he had rescued and now treated with principled kindness, but could never truly love in return. And the thought of loving him while believing herself merely his duty seemed a particular exquisite torture that Eleanor nevertheless could not prevent, because her heart had apparently decided to ignore all her careful defenses. Their return to London in mid-July coincided with the height of the season, when every ballroom blazed with candlelight and every drawing room hummed with gossip, and Alexander had secured their invitation to the Pemberton Ball, which was understood to be one of the premier events of the summer, where all of society's most influential figures would gather. And Eleanor stood in their London townhouse dressing room, feeling as though she might be sick, as her lady's maid fastened the final hooks on a gown of deep sapphire silk that Alexander had commissioned from London's finest modiste. A dress cut in the latest fashion that made her look almost beautiful, or at least striking in a way her previous modest gowns had never achieved. Alexander appeared in the doorway, already dressed in formal black evening wear that emphasized his broad shoulders and aristocratic bearing. And when his eyes met hers in the mirror, she saw something that looked remarkably like admiration before he crossed the room and lifted from its case a stunning sapphire necklace that had belonged to his mother, fastening it around Eleanor's throat with fingers that lingered against her skin and sent shivers down her spine despite her terror. The carriage ride to the Pemberton residence passed in a blur of Alexander's steady encouragement and Eleanor's mounting panic. But when they arrived and joined the queue of guests ascending the marble stairs, she felt his hand firm and warm at the small of her back, and heard him murmur that she was the most remarkable woman in London, and anyone who failed to see it was a fool beneath his notice. The butler announced them at the ballroom entrance, and Eleanor felt every eye in the glittering space turn toward them as conversation faltered, and then rose in a wave of whispers, and she wanted desperately to flee, but Alexander tucked her hand more firmly into the crook of his arm and led her forward into the room with his head high and an expression of such obvious pride that it silenced the nearest gossips into shocked silence. They made their way toward their hostess, Lady Pemberton, who had been a friend of Alexander's late mother, and the older woman greeted Eleanor with unexpected warmth, and a pointed comment loud enough for nearby listeners that she was delighted the Duke had shown such excellent judgment in his choice of bride, which Eleanor understood was a deliberate endorsement that would carry significant weight among the assembled company. Alexander procured champagne and kept Eleanor close as various acquaintances approached with careful congratulations, their curiosity barely masked by politeness, but he fielded every subtle inquiry and deflected every veiled insult with such smooth authority that Eleanor began to breathe slightly easier. Then, across the ballroom, she saw Lady Catherine Ashford standing among a cluster of matrons, and their eyes met for one charged moment before Catherine looked away first, defeat evident in the tightness of her mouth and the way she turned her back. When the orchestra struck up a waltz, Alexander led Eleanor onto the floor, despite her whispered protest that surely he should dance with other ladies of consequence. But he pulled her into his arms with perfect propriety and told her that he intended to dance every dance with his wife and make absolutely clear to every person present that he considered himself the most fortunate man in England. And as they moved through the turns, Eleanor felt the weight of society's gaze transform from judgment to something closer to envy, as Alexander looked at her throughout the dance with an attention and devotion that could not be mistaken for duty. The transformation that followed the Pemberton ball exceeded anything Eleanor could have anticipated, for within days she found herself receiving morning callers in quantities that would have been unthinkable mere weeks ago. Ladies who had previously looked through her as though she were invisible, now arriving at the Thornhill townhouse with cards and invitations and barely concealed curiosity about the Duke's unexpected bride who had captured his such obvious devotion. Eleanor navigated these visits with a grace that surprised even herself, neither gloating over her elevated position nor cowering from those who had previously scorned her, but instead conducting herself with a quiet dignity that acknowledged her new status while refusing to pretend the past had not occurred. She found particular satisfaction in showing kindness to the young women who reminded her of her former self, the wallflowers and overlooked girls who attended events on the periphery, hoping not to be noticed in their plainness or poverty. And Eleanor made deliberate efforts to draw these women into conversation and introduce them to eligible gentlemen of her acquaintance, using her new consequence to shift social dynamics in small but meaningful ways. Alexander watched these developments with evident pride that warmed Eleanor from the inside out, and she would catch his eyes on her across drawing rooms and ballrooms with an expression that seemed to convey both admiration and something deeper that made her heart race with hope and confusion. Their marriage had become the talk of the season, but not in the scandalous way Eleanor had feared, for instead the gossip centered on speculation about whether the Duke had truly formed an attachment or merely performed duty with exceptional grace, until gradually the weight of evidence suggested the former, because no man could feign the attention Alexander paid his wife, or the way his face softened when she entered a room, or how he seemed utterly uninterested in any female company but hers. Lady Catherine Ashford had become a diminished figure in society's estimation, her role in orchestrating the conservatory scandal having become common knowledge through channels Eleanor suspected Alexander had deliberately employed, and the matrons who had once followed Catherine's lead now gave her the cut direct, while elevating Eleanor as an example of dignity rewarded. Eleanor's confidence blossomed like the roses in the Thornhill Gardens under such changed circumstances, and she discovered within herself a strength and social acuity she had never known she possessed, moving through London society no longer as a supplicant hoping for acceptance, but as a woman who knew her own worth and the regard of the man whose opinion mattered most. One evening at the Sinclair Musicale, Alexander took her hand during a particularly moving soprano performance and raised it to his lips in a gesture that might have seemed merely courtly, except that his mouth lingered against her gloved knuckles several seconds longer than propriety demanded, and his eyes, when they met hers, held heat that made her breath catch, and her awareness of him sharpen into something almost painful in its intensity. The evening after the Sinclair Musicale, Eleanor found herself alone in the drawing-room of their London townhouse, the summer twilight casting long golden shadows across the Persian carpet as she stood by the window watching the street below where carriages passed in an endless procession of London society moving from one entertainment to the next. And she was so lost in thought about the way Alexander had kissed her hand, and looked at her with such intensity, that she did not hear him enter until his voice spoke her name softly from the doorway. She turned to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something vulnerable and uncertain that seemed at odds with his usual composed authority, and he crossed the room slowly, as though approaching something precious and fragile that might startle and flee if he moved too quickly. Eleanor felt her heart begin to race as he stopped an arm's length away, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the way his throat worked as he swallowed before speaking. And when his words came, they were so quiet she had to lean closer to hear them clearly. He told her that he needed to speak honestly about something that had been weighing on his conscience for weeks, that their marriage had begun under circumstances neither of them would have chosen, but that somewhere in the months since their wedding, his feelings had undergone a transformation he had not anticipated, and Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs as he continued speaking with a rawness that stripped away all his aristocratic polish. Alexander confessed that what had begun as respect and admiration and a desire to right an injustice had deepened into something far more profound, that he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with his wife, and he asked with such painful uncertainty whether she could ever feel the same, or whether the circumstances of their marriage had poisoned any possibility of genuine affection on her part. The walls Eleanor had carefully maintained around her heart for so many weeks crumbled in an instant, and she found tears streaming down her face as she reached for his hands and pulled them against her chest, where he could surely feel her racing pulse. She told him through her tears that she had been terrified to hope he might care for her beyond duty, that she had fallen in love with him weeks ago during their walks in the Thornhill Gardens and their conversations in the library, and every moment he had shown her the kindness and regard she had never believed herself worthy of receiving. Alexander's face transformed with such joy and relief that he looked years younger, and he raised trembling hands to cup her face and wipe away her tears with his thumbs, before asking in a voice rough with emotion if he might kiss her, truly kiss her, not as duty or propriety dictated, but as a man kisses the woman he loves beyond reason. Eleanor's whispered yes was lost against his mouth as he claimed her lips with a tenderness that quickly deepened into passionate hunger, and she felt the shift between them as their formal marriage transformed in that moment into something wild and real and entirely theirs. The weeks following their confession transformed the Thornhill marriage into something Eleanor had only read about in novels, a partnership of minds and hearts that deepened with each passing day as they moved through London society, not as Duke and Duchess performing roles, but as husband and wife genuinely devoted to one another in ways that became impossible to conceal or mistake for mere duty. Eleanor stepped fully into her position with Alexander's unwavering support, and they became inseparable in both public and private spheres, attending events together where his hand would find the small of her back possessively, and his eyes would seek hers across crowded rooms with looks that made her blush and feel desired in ways she had never imagined possible. They worked together on estate matters and charitable endeavors, Eleanor discovering she had a talent for organization and a genuine concern for the tenants and servants whose lives depended on Thornhill generosity, and Alexander valued her input so clearly that it became known among their staff that the Duchess was not merely ornamental, but essential to the smooth running of their properties. Their nights became explorations of passion and tenderness that left Eleanor astonished at the pleasure possible between husband and wife, and she would wake in Alexander's arms, feeling cherished and beautiful and worthy in ways that healed wounds she had not fully acknowledged carrying. It was during this period of profound happiness that a letter arrived from India bearing Captain James Langley's handwriting, and Eleanor felt her stomach drop when Alexander brought it to her in the morning room where she was reviewing menus with the housekeeper. Alexander's face was unreadable as he handed her the letter, and Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers to find a lengthy confession that confirmed what she had long suspected but never had proven. Captain Langley wrote that his conscience had been tormenting him across the miles and months since his departure, and he detailed how Lady Catherine Ashford had approached him with a scheme to compromise Eleanor as revenge for some perceived slight involving her niece, offering him money and the promise of social advancement if he would play his part in the conservatory trap. The captain apologized profusely for his weakness and moral failure, expressing shame at having allowed himself to be used as an instrument of cruelty against an innocent woman, and he asked for forgiveness while acknowledging he had no right to expect it. Eleanor read the letter twice before handing it to Alexander, whose face darkened with protective fury as he absorbed the written confirmation of the deliberate nature of the plot against his wife. He rose from his chair with barely controlled anger and paced to the window, his hands clenched behind his back, and when he turned to face Eleanor, his voice was tight with rage as he asked what she wished him to do with this information that could utterly destroy Lady Catherine's remaining social standing. Eleanor considered carefully before answering, feeling the weight of vindication, but also recognizing that revenge would require her to dwell in the past rather than embrace the future. And she told Alexander quietly that she wished to forgive Captain Langley for his weakness, while neither forgetting nor actively punishing the wrong that had been done. Alexander crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, his anger melting into admiration for her grace, and they decided together to file the letter away and focus instead on the happiness they had built from the ashes of scandal, refusing to allow old injuries to poison the extraordinary love they had found. The autumn of 1818 brought with it a discovery that transformed Eleanor's already profound happiness into something almost sacred, as she stood in her dressing room one October morning, feeling a peculiar light-headedness that her lady's maid noticed before Eleanor herself fully understood its significance. And within days, the physician confirmed what Eleanor had begun to suspect, with a mixture of wonder and trepidation, that she was carrying Alexander's child. She told him that evening in the library at Thornhill, where they had returned for the autumn months, and the expression on his face when she spoke the words shifted through surprise to such radiant joy that tears sprang to her eyes as he crossed to her and sank to his knees before her chair, pressing his face against her still flat stomach with a tenderness that made her heart ache with the depth of her love for this man who had transformed her life so completely. Alexander became impossibly more attentive and protective as the weeks passed, and Eleanor's condition became evident, fussing over her comfort and health in ways that would have annoyed her had they not been so clearly motivated by genuine devotion and wonder at the miracle of the child growing within her. Sophia visited in late November and stayed through the Christmas season, her delight in her sister's pregnancy infectious, and her presence a comfort, as Eleanor navigated the physical challenges and emotional intensity of carrying her first child, while reflecting often on how dramatically her circumstances had changed in the 18 months since that terrible night at the Ashford ball. Eleanor would sit in the morning room with her hands resting on her expanding belly, watching the winter landscape through frost-covered windows, and marvel at the transformation from overlooked spinster-facing ocean ruin to beloved Duchess carrying the future heir to one of England's greatest titles. And she recognized with profound gratitude that true worth had always resided within her, waiting only for someone perceptive enough to see it. Her mother arrived in January with an effusive relief and pride that Eleanor found both touching and slightly amusing, given Margaret Whitmore's earlier despair over her eldest daughter's marriage prospects, and watching her mother fuss over preparations for the nursery. Eleanor felt old resentments dissolve into understanding that society's pressures had shaped her mother's anxieties, just as they had nearly destroyed Eleanor's own sense of value. The London society that had once scorned her now sent gifts and congratulations celebrating the expected Thornhill heir, and Eleanor read the effusive notes from ladies who had snubbed her at balls with a detachment born of hard-won wisdom about the fickleness of social approval and the emptiness of validation from those who judged by surfaces rather than character. Alexander commissioned a portrait of Eleanor in her pregnancy that spring, wanting to capture this moment of their lives, and as she sat for the artist with Alexander watching from across the room, she met his eyes and saw reflected there the same wonder she felt at how the worst moment of her life had led inexorably to the best, how scandal and shame had been the unlikely pathway to love and security beyond anything she had imagined possible for herself. The labor began on a mild April morning in 1819, when Eleanor woke at dawn with a tightening sensation across her belly that she initially dismissed as the common discomforts of late pregnancy. But within hours, the pains had intensified into unmistakable contractions that sent Alexander into a state of barely controlled anxiety as he summoned the physician and midwife while refusing absolutely to leave Eleanor's side, despite convention dictating that childbirth was women's domain from which husbands should be excluded. Eleanor found his presence both comforting and slightly amusing as this man who commanded vast estates and influenced political decisions became nearly helpless in the face of her suffering, holding her hand and wiping her brow and murmuring encouragement as the hours stretched through morning into afternoon, and the pains became stronger and closer together until she thought she might break from the intensity of it. The midwife assured them all was progressing normally, but Eleanor had never experienced anything so overwhelming as this force of nature moving through her body, and she clung to Alexander's hand with strength that would leave bruises as she labored to bring their child into the world, while he whispered that she was the strongest person he had ever known, and that he loved her beyond measure. As evening approached and the light through the bedchamber windows turned golden, Eleanor gave a final desperate push, and suddenly there was a new sound in the room, the powerful wail of an infant announcing her arrival into the world, and the midwife placed the tiny squirming baby on Eleanor's chest, while Alexander's face transformed with such wonder and joy that Eleanor felt tears streaming down her own cheeks as she looked down at their daughter. The baby was perfect, small but healthy, with a surprising amount of dark hair and eyes that would likely turn the same deep brown as Alexander's, and as Eleanor held her, and felt the warm weight of this new life against her breast, she experienced a love so profound and immediate that it seemed to expand her heart beyond what she had thought possible. Alexander touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, his own hand trembling, and when the infant grasped his finger reflexively, he made a sound that was half laugh and half sob as he leaned down to kiss Eleanor's forehead and then their daughter's with infinite tenderness. They named her Catherine Eleanor after both grandmothers, but also in deliberate reclamation of the name from past hurt, transforming it into something beautiful and beloved rather than bitter, and Eleanor felt a sense of completion as she lay exhausted in the bed, with Alexander beside her and their daughter sleeping peacefully in the cradle he had commissioned months earlier. The three of them formed a circle of intimacy in that quiet room as the spring evening deepened into night, and Eleanor recognized with overwhelming gratitude that her journey from overlooked wallflower to scandalous woman to beloved wife had reached its fulfillment in this moment of becoming mother, that every difficulty and humiliation and fear had been the pathway to this profound joy she now held in her arms. The spring of 1821 brought with it a grand ball at Thornhill Estate that Eleanor had spent weeks planning with a confidence and grace that would have seemed impossible to the uncertain young woman she had been just 4 years earlier. And as she stood in the receiving line beside Alexander greeting their guests, she felt the weight of her transformation not as burden, but as gift. The Duchess of Thornhill, in silk of deepest sapphire, with Alexander's grandmother's diamonds at her throat, and her dark hair arranged in elegant curls that framed a face no longer pinched with anxiety, but radiant with contentment and purpose. The ballroom glowed with hundreds of candles reflecting off polished floors, and the massive arrangements of white roses and lilac that filled the air with their gentle perfume, and Eleanor moved through the gathering with the ease of someone who had finally grown into her own skin, greeting old friends and new acquaintances with genuine warmth, while her eyes tracked the young women standing nervously at the edges of the dance floor with the particular attention of someone who remembered all too well what it felt like to be invisible. Catherine toddled between her parents in a dress of white muslin with pink ribbons, her dark curls bouncing as she charmed the assembled guests with the unself-conscious delight of a child just past her 2nd birthday. And Eleanor watched Alexander scoop their daughter into his arms with the same tender devotion he had shown since the moment of her birth, his love for both wife and child evident in every gesture and glance. Eleanor made her way deliberately to where 3 young women stood together near the refreshment table, their postures betraying their discomfort, and their modest gowns marking them as girls of respectable but unremarkable families, and she engaged them in conversation with genuine interest about their reading and their thoughts on the countryside, drawing them out with the same patience Alexander had once shown her, and watching their faces transform as someone of consequence actually saw them and valued their words. She invited each to call upon her during their stay in the neighborhood, and made certain they were introduced to suitable dancing partners, using her position to extend to others the gift of recognition that had been so transformative in her own life. And she felt Alexander's eyes on her from across the room, warm with pride and admiration that had not dimmed in all their years together, but had only deepened into something more profound than the initial attraction of their courtship. Lady Catherine Ashford was present among the guests, diminished now in both consequence and spirit after a series of social missteps had eroded her standing, and when Eleanor greeted her, there was no triumph in her manner, but rather a gracious courtesy that spoke more eloquently than any revenge of how completely Eleanor had transcended the malice that had once threatened to destroy her. The evening unfolded in music and laughter and the pleasure of good company, and as Eleanor danced a waltz with Alexander while their daughter watched, clapping her small hands in delight, She reflected that her victory was not over those who had scorned her, but over the fear and shame that had once made her believe she deserved their scorn, that the greatest transformation had been not in her circumstances, but in her recognition of her own enduring worth. The last guests departed near midnight, and Eleanor bid them farewell with the gracious warmth that had become natural to her over these years of marriage. But as the carriages rolled down the long drive, and the final echoes of conversation faded into the spring night, she felt a profound relief to return to, the quieter intimacy that was the truest heart of her life. And she found Alexander in the library, where so much of their connection had first deepened into something beyond duty or gratitude, into genuine partnership and love. He stood by the tall windows that overlooked the moonlit gardens, still handsome in his evening clothes, though he had loosened his cravat in the privacy of this room that had always been their sanctuary. And when he turned at the sound of her entrance, his face held that particular expression of tenderness and admiration that never failed to move her even after 4 years of seeing it, almost daily. Eleanor crossed to him, and he took her hand in both of his, raising it to his lips in a gesture that was both courtly and deeply intimate, and she leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, as they stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment. "It seems a lifetime ago that we stood in this very room and you showed me the books you thought I might enjoy," she said softly, remembering that early tentative period when she had been so uncertain of everything, including her own worth and his intentions. Alexander's arms came around her, and she felt him rest his chin gently atop her head. "I was terrified you would never trust me," he admitted, with the vulnerability he had learned to show her over their years together. "You were so fragile then, like something wounded that might bolt if I moved too quickly, and I wanted desperately to show you that you were safe with me, that I saw you for who you truly were." Eleanor turned in his embrace to look up at him. "Do you know what I think of sometimes?" she asked, and continued without waiting for his answer. "I think of that terrible night in the Ashford conservatory, and I feel an almost perverse gratitude for it, because without that humiliation and scandal, I might have spent my entire life invisible, might have accepted some tepid offer from a man who would never truly see me, might never have known what it was to be loved as you love me." Alexander's expression grew fierce with feeling. "That night was the greatest gift fate ever gave me, despite the pain it caused you," he said. "When I saw you trapped in that manufactured scandal, I knew I had been given the opportunity I had been seeking for months, a way to make you mine without the slow dance of courtship that might have led nowhere given your modesty and my own hesitation. I have never regretted the unconventional beginning of our marriage, only the suffering it cost you before you understood my true intentions." They stood together as the clock on the mantel chimed 1 in the morning, and Eleanor thought about the children sleeping upstairs, Catherine, with her wild dark curls spread across her pillow, and the infant James in his cradle, about the life they had built together that was so much richer than anything she had imagined possible in those dark days after the scandal. "We will have more children," Alexander said, as though following her thoughts, "and we will teach them to see worth where others overlook it, to choose character over appearance, to trust in transformation and second chances." Eleanor rose on her toes to kiss him with the easy affection of long intimacy. "We will teach them that the judgments of society matter far less than the truth of one's own heart," she agreed, "and that love can find us even in our darkest moments if we are brave enough to accept it." The summer afternoon was warm and gentle as Eleanor walked through the gardens of Thornhill Estate, with Catherine's small hand clasped trustingly in her own, and infant James nestled against her shoulder in a carrying sling that the village women had shown her how to fashion the unconventional arrangement one that Alexander had encouraged despite her mother's protests that a duchess should not carry her own child like a common peasant. But Eleanor had learned over these years of marriage that the opinions that mattered were those of the small circle of people she loved and trusted rather than the vast, judgmental mass of society that had once seemed so omnipotent and is now revealed as merely loud. The roses were in full bloom, and their fragrance hung heavy in the air, mixing with the scent of lavender and the freshly turned earth, where the gardeners had been working under Eleanor's direction to create a new section devoted to wildflowers. A small rebellion against the formal perfection that was expected of ducal gardens, but one that brought her deep satisfaction as she watched butterflies and bees move among the deliberately untamed blooms. Catherine stopped to examine a ladybug crawling across a leaf with the intense focus that children bring to small wonders, and Eleanor crouched beside her daughter, feeling James shift and settle against her chest, his warm weight and milky scent filling her with a contentment so profound it sometimes brought tears to her eyes when she allowed herself to fully acknowledge how different this reality was from the future she had grimly anticipated at 24, when marriage seemed increasingly unlikely and spinsterhood loomed as her probable fate. She heard Alexander's footsteps on the gravel path before she saw him, and knew his gait as well as she knew her own heartbeat, after years of listening for his approach, with the eagerness that had replaced her early uncertainty. And when she looked up, he was there in his shirt-sleeves, with his coat discarded somewhere in the house, and his cravat loosened in the summer heat. Looking younger than his 36 years, and happier than she suspected he had ever been in the decades before their marriage, when duty and loneliness had been his constant companions. He bent to swing Catherine into his arms, and the little girl shrieked with delight as he spun her in a circle before settling her on his hip, and then his free arm came around Eleanor's waist, drawing her close so that they stood together as a family unit complete and whole in the golden afternoon light. This is everything, Eleanor thought, but did not say aloud, because the words seemed inadequate to capture the fullness of what she felt. How the scandal that had seemed like the end of her life had instead been the violent rupture necessary to break her free from the small, constrained existence she had been taught to expect and propel her into this outer, more vivid reality, where she was seen and valued and loved beyond measure. She had been raised to believe that her worth was contingent on beauty she did not possess, and fortune she did not have, that her value must be earned through perfect behavior and constant self-effacement. But Alexander had shown her through years of patient devotion that her worth was inherent and unchanging, that she had always been enough and more than enough, that the lack had been in society's vision rather than in her substance. The garden stretched around them, tended and beautiful. The house stood solid behind them, filled with books and comfort, and the life they had built together. And above them the sky arched blue and cloudless, promising fair weather ahead. And Eleanor understood with the clarity that comes from surviving darkness and emerging into light, that she had never been the inadequate creature society had named her, but rather a woman of strength and dignity, waiting only for someone with eyes clear enough to see her truly. Perhaps you are listening to this story in a quiet moment of your own life, in a season when you feel overlooked or dismissed or judged for circumstances beyond your control. And if so, I want you to know that Eleanor's journey from that terrible night in the conservatory to the sunlit gardens where she stood with her family was not merely the invention of romance, but rather a reflection of a truth that exists in all our lives if we have courage enough to recognize it. The world will tell you that your worth depends on qualities you may not possess, on beauty that fades, or wealth that fluctuates, or youth that passes, on the approval of people who do not truly see you, and the validation of systems designed to elevate only a fortunate few while dismissing the rest as inadequate or invisible. Eleanor believed these lies for 24 years until catastrophe forced transformation and revealed what had always been true, that her value was inherent and unchanging, that she had never been the lacking creature society named her, but rather a woman of substance waiting only for eyes clear enough to perceive her truly. Your darkest moments may become your greatest gifts, though you cannot see it while you stand in the shadows, and the judgment that feels devastating today may be the force that breaks you free from a smaller life than you were meant to live and propels you toward a future more vivid and fulfilling than anything you currently imagine possible. True love, whether romantic or the love of friends or family or even love of self, sees what others overlook and values what society dismisses. And there are people in this world who will recognize your worth even when you have ceased to believe in it yourself. Hold fast to dignity when the world is cruel. Maintain grace when others offer only judgment. Trust that transformation can arrive in a moment, though it may take years to fully unfold. And know that it is never too late for new beginnings or second chances or the recognition you have always deserved. If Eleanor's story has moved you or brought you hope or reminded you of your own inherent worth, I invite you to join our community of listeners who believe in the power of these truths, who find comfort in stories of overlooked individuals finally seen and valued, who understand that happy endings are not fantasies but possibilities available to all of us when we refuse to accept the limitations others place upon us. Subscribe to hear more stories of transformation and recognition, of love that sees truly and worth that cannot be diminished by judgment, of women and men who defied expectations and claimed lives of fulfillment despite the obstacles placed before them. You are not alone in your struggles or your hopes, and your story, like Eleanor's, may be only at its beginning, regardless of how many years you have lived or how many disappointments you have endured. The conservatory moment that nearly destroyed her became the gateway to everything she had ceased to hope for, and your own difficult season may be preparing you for joy you cannot yet imagine. Thank you for listening, and may you find the courage to see yourself as you truly are, worthy of love and recognition and all the beautiful transformation that awaits.